This week on Reverberate, Pastor Jed, Pastor Isaiah, and I discuss Ecclesiastes' view of our work. Solomon warns that our toil is fleeting, yet he also says there's nothing better than enjoying our work. Is he just being sarcastic there? How can we approach our toil under the sun with joy and thankfulness without making work our source of meaning and burning ourselves out? Let's get into it. Solomon in Ecclesiastes 3 says that he perceived that there's nothing better for us to do than be joyful and to do good as long as we live. And everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. But just a few verses before, in verse 9, he says, "What gain has the worker from his toil?" He calls it fleeting. So here, when he's telling us there's nothing better for us to do, is he being sarcastic?
It depends on how you read Solomon overall from this book. There are people who interpret Solomon as being kind of bitter, cynical old man who says it's all bad and maybe hopefully there's something beyond this so that it won't be all bad. That's one way to interpret Solomon. I don't think that's accurate for what he's saying in a lot of ways. I do think that there are times he gets pretty close to that because he's making a point, but I don't think that's his overall idea. And one place that I find really helpful for this, because there are these statements, there's nothing better than, and he gives a lot of different things. We can say that sarcastically. I guess there's just nothing better, like nothing good. Or you can say, oh, there's nothing. If I'm talking about a chocolate cake my wife makes, and I'm like, oh, I love dessert, and there is nothing better than my wife's chocolate cake. That's not cynical. We all can use it that way. One reason I think Solomon is not using it in a cynical way is if you look at Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 18, you have almost the exact same statement as far as the things he's looking at, but he doesn't use the nothing better language. He says, "Behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun the few days of his life that God has given him." There, he's not doing what sounds to us cynical. There's nothing better. He's just saying this is good and fitting. And I think that's the way we should read nothing better throughout the whole book. Is there's this list, and it's actually quite simple in many ways. There's this list of things. He says these are good. Basically, enjoy God's good gifts, enjoy your work, and do good. That's really what he's saying. And we want to do so much more than that. We want to build a legacy to our name that will last forever. We want to guarantee that I won't be hurt. We want to make sure that I prosper and make sure that I have enough pleasure to outweigh any potential sadness that might ever come my way. We want to have all these grand and glorious big things that, in fact, I can't control, and the harder I try, the worse my life gets. And instead, Solomon is just continually coming back to this idea. He's saying there's nothing better. What's good and fitting for a creature made in the image of God is to enjoy God, enjoy his gifts, enjoy the fruitful labor. He says toil, but just think like, whatever God puts in front of you to do that can be productive and beneficial and good, enjoy it. Don't just go, I guess I have to. Oh, enjoy it. You think of someone who loves to garden. And for some people, getting out and working in a garden is like torture. And for some people, it is so exciting to just watch, oh, this plant came up and, oh, I get to eat a tomato that I grew. It's like, it's one tomato. It's not going to keep you full for very long. But you enjoy it because you go, I enjoy this good gift, and I actually enjoyed the labor that gets this ready, the work that goes into it. He's encouraging us to that kind of enjoyment. It's not sarcastic. It's just this is good. And specifically then, I think there's another term that we wrestle with a little, and you mentioned chapter 3, verse 9, what gain has the worker from his toil? There, I think it's, if you look through the book, this gain, we might read it like, what good is it? What good is this work? Again, if you view Solomon as a cynical guy in the book, that's the way you would read it. What's the point? It's all pointless anyway. What good is it? He doesn't say good. He uses gain specifically, which is used for something like profit, like return on investment. For me, I like to think of it, if you go on a vacation and you put a whole lot of work into this vacation, a lot of planning, you spend a lot of money, you do all this stuff, and then you go and whatever you do on your vacation, whatever a good vacation looks like to you, you go do all those things. And then a lot of times I hear people say when they come back, they're like, oh, I need a vacation from my vacation. I'm tired. So you go, you put in all this work at the beginning, and then you had a great time, and then you feel worn out at the end. Is it good? Maybe. Probably. Is it like gain, like profit? Did you end up with more than you had in the first place? Could you have just relaxed for the first week or two while you were planning and then relaxed when you got back and stayed home for the vacation and still had a good time? Maybe. So it's a good thing, but is it a now I have a profit? Now I have something left over? Maybe not. I think the same kind of thing is what Solomon's doing. And I think it's what he did in chapter 2 when he talks about his labor. He says, I put in all this work. I did all of these things. And yet then he gets down to the end of all of his description of his productivity, of the garden that he built, of all of those things. And he says, I considered all my hands had done and the toil I had expended in doing it. So he's like, I accomplished all this stuff. In fact, he said right before that, I became great and surpassed all who were before me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. He's like, I got this reward from the toil, but at the end of the day, I worked really hard, and I got roughly the equivalent reward out. He's like, there's no leftover. There's no gain. In other words, you can't put in work and then have passive income for your productivity the rest of life. Now, that may work in a financial sense, but in a sense of what really satisfies your soul, in a sense of those kinds of questions. He's like, what gain ultimately, since there's times when you succeed and things grow and times when things are torn down? What profit? What leftover? What on top of the effort you put in? What is there in work? So it doesn't contradict what he's saying when he says it's good to enjoy your work. You have work. Enjoy the fruitful labor in front of you. But it's not going to give you enough profit that you can sit back and then just relax and say, my soul's perfectly fine because I've done fruitful labor.
Yeah, don't ask from work what only God can give, right?
Mhm.
Like, I think that's just simply what's going on. It's not a contradiction. It's just like a redirect of expectations. And I think people are picking up on the fact that there is a kind of correction. And so then I think they're overreading into it the cynical, because I would agree with Jed that he's not being like sarcastic or anything like that, because even he mentioned the fact that, and Jed just read from it, the fact that there was reward from labor. The idea that it's not permanent. It doesn't last. It's fleeting, right? It's like trying to grasp for the wind and all these kinds of things. And so like when you consider it that way, okay, yeah, it can't give me that lasting gain, like ultimate final meaning, that you can still receive the work itself as a part of God's good gift to you. Because I do believe that little phrase there, I think it's 3:13, this is God's gift. I think that's really the hinge. He wants you to really embrace it as a gift. And then so everything else he's saying is being colored, if you will, or flavored through, okay, this is God's gift. But then you treat it as a gift and not as the ultimate meaning and purpose and the thing to live for.
Yeah, when you pursue work for work to give you something else. And don't think, when you read Solomon talking about work, don't think 9-to-5 job. That's included, but that's not what he's talking about. He's saying when you wake up, whatever fruitful, productive effort you think of, it could be the guy who says, I want to go to the gym and I want to work out. Nobody's paying him for it, but it's effort. It's labor. He's saying, enjoy that. Enjoy gardening. Enjoy building something at your house. Enjoy repairing your car. You're like, I don't want to repair these things. They're frustrating, right? Yeah, he's saying you live in a world where you have the agency and the capacity to make some things better. God has prepared, Ephesians says he's prepared good works for you. So you go, this conversation is going to be a little hard with this person. Enjoy the fact that you can actually step in and do good here. You can do something useful. That's the way he's thinking about work, instead of thinking, I go work so that I can provide something beyond that. There is a provision element, but I can provide this satisfaction or this leftover joy or this contentment or this peace or whatever. He's like, your labor is not going to give you that.
In previous conversations, I remember being struck by how Solomon goes through really deep, hard arguments to come to seems like an overly simple conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
Is it really just simple gratitude? Is that the point of our lives?
I think there is. Actually, I think it's joy is what he points to repeatedly. I know I mentioned this before, but he talks about joy just by way of the amount of times. He talks about joy more than vanity in Ecclesiastes. Nobody seems to pick that up just reading through it, including me, just reading through it without actually asking the question. But it's mentioned more times. he's saying, how do you live a life that's full of joy? How do you live the good life? That's literally what Solomon's asking. And he's saying there's a lot of ways you can pursue it that won't work. So, yes, it's a call to find joy, which gratitude is a part of that, I think, is recognizing here's good that I've been given. I enjoy this good that I've been given. We call that both joy, and when we recognize that it comes from someone, it's gratitude. So yeah, in many ways, he is calling you, he's wrestling with all kinds of complicated things to get to fairly simple solutions.
So on the topic of our toil, Ecclesiastes 4:6 says, "Better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and a striving after wind." And is this handful of quietness? You mentioned in your sermon that it's this two-handed grasping of our lives versus having a handful of quietness. Is that mostly an internal posture, or should that actually change our schedule and our pace of life and the amount of commitments that we commit ourselves to?
It has to be both, really. If you get the internal posture right, it will change the external side. You can get the external posture right without ever changing the internal side. So it is entirely possible that, and I've been here before myself, where you change your schedule, your pace, and your commitments, and you are still two-handed grasping without any peace just as hard as you were before, but you can forget about it more because you might have more hobby time or more whatever, right? So merely changing the external side, I would argue, won't change anything internally in itself. Not that it can't help, but if that's the only thing that happens, if your internal posture stays the same, but your calendar gets more clear, then I don't think you're solving the problem Solomon's talking about. I love that he gives us these, like, you could spend a long time just thinking about that phrase, like that image, 2 hands of grasping after wind. You're working as hard as you possibly can, but what you're trying to achieve in your work is to control something that you can't control. And we've been there plenty of times, versus, and I love the contrast, again, Solomon's poetically, he's brilliant, 1 handful of quietness. Like, what happened to my other hand? I've got 2 of them, right? So he's not saying, let whatever happens, don't work. He's saying, work hard with 1 hand. Not everything you possibly could to work hard. I remember a stretch where I was worried, extending myself in terms of calendar, schedule, commitments, probably further than I should. And I remember struggling to sleep because you're anxious. Your mind's just racing. You're going, oh, I could get up. I could do something. I could do this. And I remember having to consciously think, like, a step of trusting God right now is to trust that if I tried to stay up as long as I possibly could, I would accomplish far less than God can accomplish while I'm sleeping. And just to remember, both of my hands put together, working as hard as I can, is nothing compared to what God can do. And I think that sense of peace, that sense of, okay, I don't grasp with both hands as hard as I can. Now, I find actually that the more I get the internal posture right, the more I am thrilled to go do productive work. I find it really hard when I'm two-handed grasping after wind. I can have one task on my to-do list and it's hard to get started. When I have this peace and I also go, man, I can go be fruitful, and the results of that they're in God's hands, I can accomplish a ton more with that internal posture than I do with the 2 hands grasping after wind.
I remember in your sermon you mentioned the workaholic doesn't necessarily work too hard, but he's trusting too hard in the wrong thing. So I guess from your personal example, or as you counsel people, how can someone discern that in their own heart as they're going through the work of trying to align their internal posture? And especially if they are in a busy season of life, how can they tell if their work's flowing from faithfulness or from fear and a desire for control?
As I was working through that stage of my life, and still struggle with it at times, but as I was working through that, I told someone, I feel differently about the things I'm not getting done. I think that's a good diagnostic question. When you're going, I'm working really hard. All right, I am sure there are things you wish you could get done that you're not getting done. How do you feel about that? Because if you're sitting there and that gives you anxiety, angst, fear, anger, whatever, I think you're trying to control something you can't. Now, if you're sitting here saying, I'm being lazy all day and I don't get these things done, okay, that's a different conversation, right? But the guy who's saying, I'm working hard, how do I know if this is because I'm desperately trying to control or if it's because of faithfulness? Is your soul resting in God and his goodness in that while you work, while you labor? Or is your soul full of knots and you're angsty, anxious, worried because you didn't get that other thing done. You didn't get that other thing done. Even asking yourself, what would it take? This is a helpful diagnostic question for me too. What would it take for me to feel like this was a successful day? And there are times when if I honestly answered that question, I would answer it with something that would be absolutely impossible. The amount of things I would say, for me to feel this is successful, it would have to be this, and the list would be absolutely impossible for a day. If that's true, then I'm obviously not operating out of faithfulness to my Creator. I'm operating out of self-trust, which comes out in control and fear.
Yeah, one of the things I like to do with this section too is take a close look at 5 and then perhaps even all the way down to 8, because he starts it by saying in verse 5, the fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. So he's obviously not endorsing doing nothing,
Right.
because that's the fool. And then in verse 6, so it's like, I think he's supposing that people are tracking. So the person reads verse 5 and thinks, so I have to work hard. And so then he hits us with verse 6 where he says, but there's a handful of quietness. So in other words, don't be the fool who folds your hands and does nothing, trying to eat his own flesh because he has nothing, no food, there's no reward, there's no fruit because he hasn't worked. Okay, but then as you do that, better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and striving after wind. Now it's interesting because this is like striving after wind, it's a phrase that keeps coming up. But if you keep reading, he'll talk about the person, there's no end to their toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? So think about this. If you're always toiling, if you're always striving, you can't even ever slow down to enjoy the things that you do have. So I think that one of the things that this has here is that a handful of quietness, this idea of being content. And as you strive, as you're working hard, are you striving with 2 hands for riches and things that are fleeting and fading? That's not going to work well for you. He says it's vanity. It's an unhappy business. Okay. But at the same time, don't be the fool who folds his hands and is trying to eat his own flesh. So that tells us that he's saying work, but as you work, I think work with a contented heart and joy. And so it ties back to what we've been asking in terms of work. Yeah, enjoy God's good gifts and the things that he's given, but there's a way to pursue certain things that ends in dissatisfaction.
Yeah, hey, that's key.
Riches,
way to
because
pursue.
There's a way to pursue because he says they're never satisfied. So if
Right.
you're the worker, if you're laborer, and you go, I'll be happy when this, or I'll be satisfied when this, and you're thinking of when I can afford that house, when I can afford that car, when I can do this. This is Solomon saying that doesn't work that way. The eye is never satisfied, which in that case means you're striving. It's probably the 2 hands trying to clasp for the win. So I think, in other words, he's identifying here in this specific context, the striving after the win with these kinds of things that don't satisfy, like the eyes are never satisfied with riches and these kinds of things. And the handful of quietness is, I have what I need. God is good. He has provided these gifts, work, and I can enjoy the gifts, the fruits of my labor and these kinds of things. So I think that needs to be perhaps pointed out because verse 5 is there, right? The fool is the one who folds up his hands. So he's not saying don't work, but as we work, there's a certain posture that we ought to be careful not to have. Oh, working hard and making the money is going to solve all of my problems. That's a big red flag because he's saying, no, it's not. And so thank God for your work and thank God that it can provide for you. And in quietness, enjoy those things. Sure, you can put in the 20 more hours. Sure, you can do this or that for whatever, that car, that house. That might really disappoint you at the end of the day. I think that's what he's saying.
And that picture, you're right, definitely bringing up verse 5, I think he's very clearly connecting them because he uses the hand imagery. The fool folds his hands. So he takes both hands and puts them across his chest and goes, all right, I'm just going to sleep and not do anything here. And he is self-destructive in it. But a handful of quietness versus two hand striving, right? Also, the handful of, it's important to make sure we know what that quietness means. He doesn't say, I think we have to be careful. We could easily read this in modern lingo and maybe in therapy speak as work-life balance. We could read that's just what he's saying. And it's not unrelated to what we talk about with work-life balance, okay? But what he's not saying, better to have one handful of good, fruitful labor and one handful of selfish indulgence. He's not making that combination, actually. Now, the fool is selfish. He's not saying one handful of work and one handful of laziness. He's not even directly saying one handful of work and one handful of sleep, although that might get closer. But it's this quietness. Now, it's not peace like shalom, like we would think of. The word there, it is the word for rest, for a restful disposition. This sense of, I can put this fruitful labor in, and I'm not desperate for it to turn out a certain way. I'm going to work. I'm going to work hard, but I'm not frantic. And that kind of quietness, in other words, I really don't think that it's even possible to solve this issue he's talking about by setting aside X number of hours for self-care. Can that be wise? Sure. We could have that conversation. That's not, though, the way you solve this problem. That's not the way he presents the problem. He says, fruitful labor, when pursued in a certain way, is frustrating. And laziness destroys yourself. So how do you have fruitful labor pursued in the right way? And that's the sense of rest, this sense of quietness in one hand that goes, I'm not God. He can accomplish far more than I would ever think. I think of maybe a practical example to take it out of work and the job context. As a parent, if you think I'm going to work so hard to train my kids, and we've probably all seen those parents who every interaction with their kids is training. It's training all the time. And their kids just get frustrated. And they get frustrated because then their kids make some maybe not so great decision. And they're like, I messed up. I've got to train more. I've got to train more. I've got to train more. This frantic, I would say that's two-handed striving. There's no peace there. It harms the relationship. On the other hand, the parent who folds their hands like, just let my kid do whatever they want. Whatever happens. Then it destroys the relationship, the kid, the parent, everything. It's awful, right? But the parent who goes, all right, fruitful labor, here's opportunities. And sometimes I'm not worried about training. We're just enjoying ice cream together. And sometimes I'm saying they're out with a friend. They have to make good decisions on their own based on what's there. And I can't control those things. One hand's got the quietness and the rest, and the other hand's going, all right, how do I intentionally have this conversation? How do I labor to teach my kid? That would be an example, I think, of an internal posture that frees the person from anxiety, but frees them to go do all these wonderful, good, fruitful, productive things.
So you're talking about Solomon presents various ways of pursuing our toil, and there's a good way and there's a bad way. And one question often comes up, is it wrong to want recognition for good work? Is that one of the good gifts we're allowed to enjoy, or is that desire of recognition, is that one of the dangers that can turn our heart away?
I would say that it's not inherently wrong, not necessarily wrong, although it is an incredible danger for us for sure. You can be Pharisaical, like you can be like the Pharisees, right? And live for the recognition, and Jesus says they have the reward, and that's it. That's all they got. But at the same time, I think of Paul's letters to the churches where he commended himself, and he says, you know our labor, like you know our toil, you know how we conducted ourselves with blamelessness among you. He's actually banking on the fact that they do think of him well.
Commending himself.
Commending
too,
himself,
like,
yeah. And
not just somebody else.
Yeah, exactly. And so there are times, and yes, he says, I'm speaking as a foolish man sometimes when he has to say, hey, don't forget how I've lived. Don't forget I am a true apostle. Don't forget these kinds of things. And so I love his humility there because it actually, I think, answers the question quite beautifully and comprehensively. Is it permissible? Is it necessarily an evil thing? Oh, the person wants recognition for his work. No. In fact, it's necessary at times for people to recognize good work. So, for example, if someone owned a business or a company and they've been working really hard to try to get people on board with good policies, good principles, a good culture, they should want to set an example for the company, and they should want to be the kind of person, like I'm saying, they should want to this. They should actually want for the people under them to be able to look up to them and go, wow, right? Again, how can Paul say to Timothy, you know my conduct, follow me, or even things like follow me as I follow Christ, as he says to certain churches. So like, I think that needs to be stated, especially in church cultures where we go, humility is such a and it's such a glorious virtue. But I think it teaches us that humility can, if you will, exist alongside of this. In fact, sometimes humility would demand that you care about what other people think of you. If you desire to be a pastor, if you desire to be an elder, you must be above reproach. You don't have the option to go, I don't care what anybody thinks ever. No, that's not a good thing. And so I think we can, by using maybe some extreme absurd examples, show that there's a place for it. Okay. But what is the place becomes more difficult. And that I have to admit, because I think we all should want to, as Christians, hear one day, well done, my good and faithful servant. We should want that. But when we live for the praise and the approval of men, we can become a slave to it. And that's when it becomes problematic. Because the same Paul that commended himself, that said, hey, what you've seen me say and do and all this, do yourself, right? And it put, for the sake even of the church, of the people themselves, where he has to remind the people of, if you will, of his credentials, he also took the humble approach and said, I'm not a servant of men, but a servant of Christ. And if I serve men, I'm no longer a servant of Christ. I'm no longer serving Christ. So there is this balance of the ultimate motivation and the ultimate. So there's a time, I say, where it serves God's purposes. It serves the sake of love and the benefit of those around you, to live in a kind of way where you care about that. For example, I care about how my children think of me because I don't want them to have to grow up thinking I mustn't be like my dad. Because guess what? For some children, that is a very godly thought. I cannot and I should not be like my dad. That's actually God glorifying, depending on who their dad was. But what an awesome thing that by God's grace, we can live in such a way where they grow up thinking, oh, I want to be like that, in that kind of way. So that's not a bad thing. Again, if now that's where all my worth and value is, now that's an idol. That's an idol. And then I can be lying. I can be putting on a mask. I can be a hypocrite and all these other things. We shouldn't be after a namesake simply for a namesake. In other words, we want to pursue authenticity. We want to pursue genuine humility. And that does, like the fool thinks is wise in his own eyes. We should be able to enter a room and think, I'm not the brightest guy here. I want to learn all this and that. And there's a good aversion to those kinds of things. I don't want people thinking wherever I go, oh, here's this great, awesome, godly person. There's a sense in which there's this kind of thing that comes with that, right? I think humility goes, guys, I have so much more flaws than you can imagine. You know what I mean? That's a good thing. But at the same time, there's a place for, if you will, this good reputation, right? I think Scripture presents it as a positive thing. It's not a negative thing. And not only that, Scripture is full of people praising one another, right? And as long as you're not desiring that and then patting yourself on the back all the way and no one's ever praising you, but you're constantly praising yourself, that's problematic. If you constantly have to point out verbally, hey, look how great I am, that's a problem. Because if those things were true, if those things were there, people will do that for you, if you will. But yes, there's, under certain circumstances, a time and a place to go, hey.
And Paul commends others too.
That's right.
In his books, towards the end of his books, repeatedly, he says, these people, they've done this, and these are their labors, and I have no one like this person. All these different things, he does commend good work. I think there's some diagnostic questions you could ask. If the question, is it wrong to want recognition for good work? I think, no. But can you do that in a bad way? Yes. One question can be, what happens in your soul if you don't get the recognition you want? Because if I don't get recognition for good work and then I respond with bitterness and I respond with anger and I respond with whatever, okay, clearly there was an idolatrous way of looking at it.
Or it's not worth it.
So even I would say to pursue work, any kind of productive labor only for the goal of recognition, I'll say that's wrong. But that's not what Paul did. Paul pursued good work because it was good and God-honoring. And where he pursues good, God-honoring work, to receive recognition is not a problem. And I think it's important for us to recognize this issue, because if it's always wrong for good work to be recognized, we will harm each other, because then how am I supposed to praise a brother or sister for their good work? If I were, I'd be praising them for something that if they actually believed it, it would be wrong for them. I can't do that. So if recognition of good work is always bad, then I can't praise anything about them, which means I can't affirm spiritual gifts. If you can't affirm and recognize good work, then somebody who's a teacher, they're gifted to be a teacher. They come and they teach, and nobody ever praises it at all, because I wouldn't want them to get proud. And then in a few years, they go, I don't know if I'm gifted at all. It doesn't seem like it's helping anyone. That's not helpful, right? So I think sometimes we are so aware of a potential danger that we forget the danger on the other side. So there is a danger in being proud and pursuing work only because you want to be seen. There's a danger in that, absolutely. There's also a danger in not affirming good work when we see it, because we're afraid someone might get proud about it. And then we're not accomplishing what we're called to do as a body either.
Normally we think of recognition for work as connected to our pride or stroking our ego or building ourselves up in some way. But I think the key is divorcing that from your pride. And there's other reasons for recognition. And I praise my wife. We were talking about this, and she'd done something, and there wasn't that recognition of good work. I was asking her how she felt about it. And she's like, well, it's more, I just want to make sure that what I did was effective. And I thought that was a really good attitude. It's like, for her, it was a sign of, if I got some feedback that this was good, then I know, okay, it accomplished its purpose. Or kind of like Paul, I'm an apostle, and my reputation means something for the body of Christ and how people think of Christ. So I want to make sure that they know, here are the good things I've done, because that's reflecting on God. So there's a higher purpose to it. It's not about Paul's ego. It's about, how is this building the body of Christ?
That's right.
Yeah, you're doing good.
Yeah.
And when you do good, that can be recognized. That's a good thing, even. And as you point out, well done, good and faithful servant is a recognition of good, right? So when you do good and it's recognized, that's good. When you do in order to be recognized, or you only label it as good if it is recognized, and you say, this isn't good unless somebody notices, that's not healthy. But to do good and then to recognize them, I think we ought to. I really do think we ought to affirm more often for our brothers and sisters around us the things they do that were good, that we noticed. Because it's an encouragement. It helps them see spiritual gifts. It helps them learn how they are helping and serving. It encourages them that God is at work through me. There's all these good things that come from that kind of affirmation, that kind of recognition of good work. And there are dangers as well, so we have to be careful about how we pursue that.
Work is a good gift from God, but it cannot provide the lasting peace, meaning, or control that only God can give. Ecclesiastes calls us to labor faithfully while resting in God with a quiet and contented heart. Next time, we will look at Jesus' statements about anxiety in Matthew 6. When Christ says, "Do not be anxious about your life," does that mean our basic needs will always be met? How should we understand his words when Christians face real hardship and struggle? We hope you'll listen in.